Hello and welcome to our podcast called Unveiling the Sultanate of Women. We are Group 8, and the purpose of this podcast is to challenge the Orientalist depiction of women in the Ottoman harem. This will be done by closely examining the Sultanate of Women in three sections: Orientalism, changes under the Sultanate of Women, and their interactions with the West. I, Cole, along with Weston and Layla, will be discussing Orientalism to begin.
Right. So to first understand Orientalist depiction, we must take a look at Edward Said's book, Orientalism. So to summarize what Said discusses in his book is that the West tended to conceptualize the Orient in a manner that imbued it with attributes such as femininity, eroticism, exoticism, and this perceived savagery. Now, what this did create was this particular framing that served as a means for the West to assert a position of superiority, aligning itself with Christian values, notions of civilizations, and a moral high ground. So, within the Middle East, specifically within the context of the Ottoman Empire, what then existed was this cultural institution known as a harem. And the harem, as governed by Islamic law, was a space considered impenetrable to all except women and male relatives. Now, something interesting to note in his book is that European interaction with the Middle East manifested in an obsession with breaching this cultural barrier. This fixation became a defining feature between the interactions of the West and the Middle East.
Edward Said also has a very interesting quote in which he says, "Creatures of a male power fantasy. They express unlimited sexuality. They are more or less stupid, and above all, they are willing." These depictions that Edward Said quotes are based on European males' travel accounts, and they tend to view harem women as being objects of pity, deprived of liberty, but also possessing a libidinous nature. And they were endorsed by their husbands and masters.
So this actually brings us to Leslie Pierce's work Beyond Harem Walls, because what essentially Pierce does is bust these myths in her article. And what makes her work all the more interesting is that she shows how crucial it is to define what actually happened within the harem walls, and she did this with the very little primary documents left on women or by women. And so prior to her work, the West perceived the Ottoman Empire as an overwhelmingly male-dominated society. So the skewed point relegated women exclusively to the domestic sphere, virtually absent from public life. Now, through Pierce's research, she refuted these notions, providing a more accurate understanding of the historical role and presence of women within the empire. She shows how women were active participants within the influential changes that took place, and that they actually helped and contributed to the success of the Ottoman Empire.
So this brings us into another article entitled "Imperial Women, Patrons of Political Power in the Ottoman Empire" by Fatima Ali and Azmat Naz. In this article, they essentially try to understand what Ottoman women actually did within the Ottoman Empire and dispel these Orientalist myths. Because we don't have very many primary documents written by women, it's easy to just assume that they almost did not exist in the public life. But as Ali and Naz proved, this is not true. Women actually experienced a great deal of liberty, social rights, and honor, reflecting the flexibility within the culture. This also extended to the political realm, and many Ottoman royal women actually held political or administrative roles in positions of power. This can be shown through the Sultanate of Women, with women like Hurrem Sultan and Safiya Sultan, who obviously almost ran the entire empire during their period and held immense political power. Obviously, if the Orientalist depictions of the Ottoman Empire were true, this would not have been able to happen, as women such as Hurrem Sultan not only corresponded with people within Europe, but were feared by people within Europe. This also talks about how Hurrem Sultan and other women within the Sultanate of Women handled matters that were both domestic and international for the Ottoman Empire. And this is very important as it shows that these women were clever and they were willing to take action at their time.
Now pivoting to the origins of Harem, or as she was once known, Roxolana. She was born in Western Ukraine, and the book written by Thomas Primack in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the West investigates through the lens of her enslavement by the Tatars who were from Crimea. And essentially, he covers the European folklore that basically rationalized why European men and women would not return to their Christian homelands. And these were folktales told as a coping mechanism and to explain why they would not return, as they would turn Turk, and they would say that this was a result of greed and Muslim decadence, and that their humble Christian relatives were taken and essentially corrupted by material wealth. And this was a very Orientalist perspective and view of the situation. And clearly, Roxolana or harem inspired folklore in the West, but she also inspired art during the Renaissance period that went down a slightly different path in regards to Orientalism. And Heather Madar investigates this in an article on Renaissance representations of elite Ottoman women. And these actually depicted women outside of the harem.
Yes, and what makes these paintings all the more interesting was that back in the day, people were throwing around these secondhand accounts and depictions of the harem and the women inside, when in truth, as we learned, most of these guys had never actually laid eyes on it. Now, the views on the Ottoman Empire were always changing. Opinions shift, new ideas pop up, and suddenly the whole scene is different. And so those artistic depictions, they represent an era that was particularly sensitive to contemporary influences. They adapted to the prevailing sentiments and movements, reflecting the ever-shifting landscape of public opinion. And so Orientalism, rather than a static concept, proved to be dynamic. Its popularity waxed and waned over time.
Yeah, and harem discourse was not appropriate to Renaissance art at the time because there was a lot of fear and reverence of the idea of the invincible Turk. And so it motivated more serious imagery. So the images of the sultans and sultanas fit this niche. So looking at this art, what do you guys notice?
I see that it emphasizes youth, beauty, elegance, regality, and importance. A lot of them are wearing European clothing. Roxolana and her daughter are shown in the same way male rulers had their portraits done. They look very serious in their pictures. And in the last image that we have on our slideshow, it depicts Roxolana as older, more severe, more focused. It makes her seem powerful and cunning. It makes her seem like the Europeans feared her almost.
And these images were produced because of intrigue in the regime of Suleiman and Roxolana. And she was the first Ottoman woman to be widely known in Europe, which was due to the pivotal role she played.
And this brings us to the perfect transition to Liana, Alara, and Gavin, who will tell us the changes under the Sultanate of Women and how they influence the Ottoman Empire.
Hello, everyone. My name is Liana. Gavin, Alara, and I will be speaking about changes and transformations under the Sultanate of Women in the Ottoman Empire, specifically focusing on Hurrem Sultan. We will explore the many ways these powerful women reshaped the political, social, and cultural landscape of the Ottoman Empire during the early modern period. First, I would like to address the rise of royal women in politics. A scholarly journal article by Fatima Ali and Azmat Naz brings up the period from 1520 to 1660 that was marked by significant changes to the Ottoman Empire's administrative system. The Ottoman palace was no longer just a royal residence. It became a center for women to gain more power, education, and influence. Royal women became especially powerful, such as the mothers of the Sultan, who heavily influenced the Sultan's decisions. Some of their roles included negotiating with ambassadors from foreign powers, being in charge of money, facilitating architectural projects, and acting as political advisors to their sons.
So expanding on, facilitating architectural projects and going beyond even diplomacy with other nations, we can take a look at how the lead sultanas, beginning with Hurrem, also had the power to make tangible change within the empire. Pinar Kayalp has an article that talks about Hurrem's effect on hospitals and her building of infrastructure within the empire. Demonstrates how a woman's touch in healthcare infrastructure brought about a new perspective in healthcare methodology, shifting focus to patient health and healing, where Sultan Suleiman and other previous male sultans were more aligned with focus on research and scientific applications. Hospital endowment deeds used as primary source evidence by Kayalp, also evidence through sheer size of Hurrem's hospital, how she physically projects the comparable power she shared with her sultan husband. Upon Hurrem's impact in particular, expanding more upon that, we have that as the first woman to come to power in the harem, she created a blueprint for the way that both East and West would view Ottoman sultanas and women. Ana Pinto Munoz has an article about how Hurrem was viewed in the Spanish Golden Age and how these Spanish playwrights used Hurrem as a caricature to represent all Ottoman sultanas, both past, present, and future. Even going so far as to anachronistically insert her as a character in a play about Sultan Saladin of the 12th century, where she is used as a caricature of his wife. Meanwhile, she's from the 16th century. And this just goes to show how Hurrem's image and impact was so powerful that she cast long shadows over both the past and future. And Safia has this correspondence letter with Elizabeth, which goes to demonstrate how later sultanas like Safia and Nurbanu, they became much more powerful through Hurrem's influence. They were able to be on equal footing with these female monarchs like Queen Elizabeth and receive gifts and even exchange regular correspondence with them.
Yeah, those are some great points, Laura. I wanted to go back to one of them, specifically the hospitals that Hurrem built with her endowments, because in Nina Gelbert's piece, Gelbert argues that this is really the departure from traditional endowments, whereas previously endowments were set up in provincial towns, mostly like religious buildings. This is really where Hurrem was recognizing her power to be a proponent of change in the empire. And so building these hospitals to help with medical science and to help with healthcare in the empire with patients is a pretty big indicator of change under Hurrem. And also talking about diplomacy, we talk about how Safaye wrote to Elizabeth I of England. Well, we can also see that start with Hurrem because she wrote to the King of Poland. She offered him gifts. She sent him gifts. She encouraged future correspondence. So we see her both recognizing herself as a domestic power, bringing about change in things like science and health in the empire, and also diplomatic power by reaching out to these foreign monarchs. And Liana, if you would like to take us to our next topic.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gavin. I really would like to address some of the common misconceptions about Ottoman women during this time period, because although they were given seemingly passive roles within the harem, a lot of women took on a lot of administrative and political roles, and these were really crucial roles within the harem and within administration. And some of their roles included negotiating with ambassadors from foreign powers, acting as political advisors to their sons. Over here, we can see one specific example was Kosem Sultan, mother of Sultan Murad IV. And Sultan Murad IV became a sultan at a very young age. So his mother was actually the one that managed all of the affairs of the empire. And things like this are often overlooked because women at the time weren't given these powerful administrative roles. So it's important to take a look at the roles they took. And it's important to note, especially, that the segregation of women within the harem didn't limit these women from creating influential societies among themselves, changing the overall social climate of the empire at large. And going off of that, I really want to talk about a primary source written by Suleiman the Magnificent to his beloved wife, Hurrem Sultan. And the Sultan adored his wife, Roxolana. He praised her in the poem, saying, "I will sing your praise always." This was at the time really going against the gender norms. And he mentioned several major cities in the poem, such as Istanbul, Anatolia, and Baghdad, to emphasize her geopolitical influence as well. And while traditional Islamic societies gave women extremely passive, submissive roles, Suleiman praised his wife, displaying a huge shift in the way women were viewed in society.
Yeah, I think that the demonstrable love the Sultan shows for her cements also just how favored Hurrem was and how much this is able to give her power in the eyes of others. And it begins a pattern that would continue with preceding sultans of choosing a favored lady of the harem. Suleiman's and Hurrem's shared love changed the structure of royal relationships and also shifted from this traditional power imbalance that was shared between sultan and any lady of the harem, where the sultan is the one in obvious power and the lady of the harem is a slave. And Suleiman almost prostrates himself for Hurrem when he's giving her all this praise, and he lifts her up while also sinking a little bit to be at her level, and it brings about this equal partnership and gives more power to women in the future for the Sultanate of women.
Yeah, that's a great point, Laura. And I also wanted to bring up Van de Guven's piece, where she says, she argues that although a lot of Hurrem's letters were written through an intermediary, they are still her voice because Hurrem was very proficient in her language. So in that way, we see that Hurrem is really seeing herself as a power, as someone who has a bit of authority over the Sultan. In her letters, even though she loves him dearly, she does mention how sad she is, how much she hopes he would return. So in this way, we are seeing a really big transformation where the Sultan's wife is more than just a concubine in the harem. She really has some power for herself over the Sultan.
Thanks to our peers, we've received some great insight from them regarding Hurrem's image through the Orientalist view as well as her importance in facilitating domestic policy. Now we will be discussing how influential Hurrem Sultan and her legacy was in Ottoman foreign policy, specifically with the European powers. This influence was especially unique and able to come about mainly through her clever personality and special relationship with Suleiman.
We all know of Leslie Pierce, a renowned historian focusing on the Ottoman Empire with an emphasis on female studies. She mentioned how hard it was for her to write a biography on Hurrem Sultan, which is extremely sorrowful given that Hurrem was a revolutionary figure in the Ottoman Empire. The lack of primary documentation leaves many wondering how impactful Hurrem truly was on Ottoman relations with the West. Oren, I know you have a compelling document to share with the rest of us and our listeners.
Yes, Alex, absolutely. After conducting my own research for some quality primary documents relating to Hurrem, otherwise known as the Roxolana, I have come across a correspondence between Hurrem Sultan and King Sigismund II of Poland after his rise to the crown.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on this document?
Well, the document is a letter written by Hurrem Sultan, and it essentially is congratulating Sigismund II for becoming the newly appointed King of Poland. It also served as a condolence to his father, Sigismund I's passing. Leslie Pierce mentions in the book, The Imperial Harem, Women and Sovereignty in the Ottoman Empire, that Hurrem maintained diplomatic correspondences with Sigismund I and II. Their diplomatic contacts were frequent, which meant that Poland maintained peace with the Ottomans. Pierce emphasizes that this was thanks to Hurrem Sultan's influence in the international sphere. It is largely because of her that they had good diplomatic relations. The letter ultimately offers definitive evidence that she helped create good connections with the Western world and solidified the Ottoman Empire's political networking during her time as the Sultana.
Those are some insightful points that are important to note. Women tend to be underappreciated in history because of their subordinate roles. What do you think set her apart from other political leaders of the time?
Well, her care and attention to the Polish crown was something another Sultana may not have done. So her background as a Ruthenian and determination to be politically active greatly contributed to Ottoman successes and foreign relations in the long run. She even embroidered gifts to Sigismund I. She learned embroidery in the Imperial Harem, according to Leslie Pierce, and often sent her creations to Sigismund I as a token of appreciation. It is extremely important and crucial to express support to political leaders in many forms, primarily gift-giving, and Hurrem Sultan's idea to send her handmade gifts was extremely effective in perpetuating these relations.
I'd like to add an excerpt from the Ukrainian historian Galina Yermolenko discussing a letter between Hurrem Sultan and Sigismund II. She said, "With the old king we were like brothers, and if it pleases the all-merciful God, with this king we will be as father as son." These words signified Sultan Suleiman's message of gratitude and appreciation towards the King of Poland, further strengthening their relationship.
What do you think was the motive of this portion of the letter?
I think the motive was to not only strengthen the diplomatic relations between Suleiman and Sigismund II, but also, as mentioned in the letter, show a brotherly relationship between them.
Another point from her letter I think should be mentioned is the continuation of her letter when she stated, "I will be very interested in this and will speak 10 times more for the good and favor of your majesty." I think her making this point was very crucial as she was trying to signify her strong desire to establish a personal connection with the King of Poland.
Yes, Alex, I completely agree. And I believe it was very important because the continued connections are what created a long-lasting bond between the two empires or two people's interests.
Certainly, Oren. To add on to Hurrem's immense diplomatic actions regarding Poland, in Yermolenko's book, we previously mentioned, Roxolana in European Literature, History, and Culture, we find some direct links between Hurrem and the preservation of Polish territories. Hurrem was so important to the Poles as she routinely advised Suleiman to protect Polish interests by preventing the Tatar raids and slave trade in the region.
I see. Her diplomacy was clearly instrumental, and as I was previously saying, mainly due to her influence and pride in her Polish heritage, truces in 1525 to 1532, 1543, and 1553 between the Ottomans and Poland were initiated. Many Polish embassies to the Sublime Porte were also formed, and this is widely considered to be attributed to Roxolana's direct influence with the Sultan and at the behest of the Polish kingdom.
Precisely. Roxolana, a former slave girl turned influential political actor, seemed to have sympathized with the girls who were taken as slaves by the Turkic Tatars and Crimean warlords to be sold off to wealthy Ottoman pashas and lords. It looks like Roxolana, using her powerful hold over the Sultan's ear, managed to have Suleiman completely forbid the Crimean Khan to bother Polish territories. This fact is attested by Piotr Opaliński, who was the Polish ambassador to Suleiman's court in 1533. It is abundantly clear to me that Hurrem's direct influence here either eliminated or at least very largely reduced the raiding and kidnapping of Polish women and territories during her reign as Sultan Suleiman's wife. She was clearly instrumental in foreign policy with the Poles in Europe. I want us to address something very critical to Hurrem's diplomatic story, and this is her direct contribution to perpetuating a tradition of diplomacy between the sultanas and Western powers, in addition to her direct interactions with the Polish crown. While Roxolana did enjoy the most diplomatic and political freedom due to her influence over Suleiman, her successors, Nurbanu and Safiye, followed in her footsteps and ensured the Ottoman Empire prospered with their European counterparts.
Very good point, David. I was just about to mention that as well. Our colleagues mentioned Dr. Pierce's book about the imperial harem beforehand, and she does an excellent job detailing Nurbanu and Safiye's diplomatic relations with Venice and England. Unlike Hurrem, though, they only communicated with females. Nurbanu had relations with Catherine de' Medici and Safiye with Elizabeth I.
It really is incredible that Hurrem was the first and last of the sultanas to directly have a correspondence with the European kingdom. What a remarkable woman.
Indeed, I completely agree.
Yes, she was, and their legacy as a Haseki Sultan continued through Nurbanu and Safiye. In Nurbanu's case, according to Dr. Pierce, she directly opposed an Ottoman admiral who wanted to besiege a Venetian territory. She ordered him not to mention this plan to the Sultan Murad. He obliged quickly to her commands and tore her documents pertaining to the siege. In doing this, Nurbanu basically stopped the war and immense bloodshed.
Wait, why did Nurbanu do that, Alex?
Well, many scholars speculate it is because of her Venetian origin, so she adamantly defended Venetian interests as the Sultana.
That makes sense. That is fascinating as well. She had a personal stake in the events that would have transpired. A sort of conflict of interest. Clever and bold action by Nurbanu there.
Indeed. As you mentioned, Nurbanu also had close ties with Catherine de' Medici and wrote to her personally. While Nurbanu did request personal favors from the Medici family, she also offered gifts like gold and silk and acknowledged Catherine's own gifts sent to the Sultana. As the mother of the French King Henry III, Nurbanu cleverly reached out to Catherine to promote good relations between the Ottoman and French courts. Nurbanu appeared to have invited Catherine to send an embassy to Istanbul to bolster the two states' relations. The flourishing trade and good relations between the Ottomans and Venetians owe a large debt to the efforts of Nurbanu. However, I feel confident that these efforts would not have been possible without Hurrem initially kickstarting the trend, so to say, of diplomatic interactions.
That's a great point. And to add on to that, Safiye Sultana also continued the tradition of being a Venetian ally. However, I want to bring up a primary source to this discussion, which is Safiye's correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I. As we can see, Safiye and Elizabeth wrote to each other as seeming friends. Looking at this source, we see how that friendship developed from that of a more formal to less formal relationship. At first, Safiye wrote with much formality, but eventually the letters became shorter, and experts believe she personally wrote the later letters, as the initial letter was much more sophisticated in its writing and were probably written by court scribes. Safiye made sure to thank Elizabeth for the gifts she sent over to the palace. As we learned in Professor Momjan's class, gift-giving was immensely important as a form of custom during the time. To quote Dr. Pierce, this exchange of gifts between monarchs was a matter of no small political import. It was an aspect of the inseparability of regal consumption and display and the exercise of royal politics. This letter sheds light on how key the sultanas were in developing relations.
Well said, Gary. Yes, and to add on, as we learned in class, the English were a later ally of the Ottomans in the timeline, and were yet to surpass them as a world power. So it was extremely critical for their relations to be friendly and establish embassies in the Ottoman Empire. It looks like Sofia largely facilitated this relationship between the two nations.
Yes, it does seem that way. Also, in that letter from Sophia to Elizabeth, I might add, we can witness how Sophia promised Elizabeth to act as an intermediary between the English and the Sultan regarding Turkish capitulations. As we all well know, the adhering to capitulations were paramount to any nation trying to establish ties with the Sultan. These diplomatic relations created solid foundations for Anglo-Ottoman relations.
Absolutely, Gary. These relations manifested themselves in the form of embassies, which, as Pierce says, was to no small extent the result of Safiya Sultan's favor. It looks like Elizabeth I needed the Sultan's help in their struggle with the dominant Habsburgs of Spain and sought out Ottoman support through her relationship with Safiya, who promoted English interests in the ears of the Sultan. Safiya was truly influential in creating alliances between these two countries.
Thank you on elaborating on Nurbanu's and Sophia's impact on Ottoman foreign relations. It shows Hurrem's lasting influence on the Ottoman Empire. She was a pioneer for female leaders and challenged the stereotypes from the Oriental view.
Thank you, guys. And now, to all our listeners around the world, or just Professor Momjan's History 111B classroom, we hope you enjoyed our insightful commentary on the Sultanate of Women with a special focus on Hurrem Sultan and her long-lasting influence on the Ottoman Empire. Thank you very much for tuning into the podcast. See you guys the same time next week for more.